series after the manger, talking about bridging the gap between the manger story that we hear, the nativity story of Christmas Eve, and the gospel stories of when Jesus starts his ministry. We're talking about what bridges the gap here. First week, we talked about what the situation of the world is that Jesus was born into with the Roman Empire and all the different circumstances. This last week, we talked all about how this story, the single story of we get Jesus as a young person, kind of his character that we've had, that we can see already in him when his parents find him in the temple during the high holidays, in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, the same one he would eventually flip tables at. And I remember thinking how epic it must have been for Jesus as a kid. Because if you only consider the stereotypes and assumptions, if Jesus is fully God and we know him for doing miracles, you might be me and wish that you could also do miracles during middle school or high school. I definitely would have been better on the football team. Football is my favorite sport, but I was talking to some guys about it last week. I was never great at football because they were like, "Are you ready to get angry?" And I was like, "What are we angry about?" And they're like, "Playing football." I was like, "It's pretty fun, isn't it?" And they're like, "No, are you ready to hit somebody?" I was like, "Why? What'd they do?" It's just there's something missing. I don't have the rage piece in it. And so I was much better at running away, which is what I ended up doing before I realized music was it for me. But the point being that, man, if I had some sort of God powers, man, you'd excel in some areas, right? Or you would have been more accepted or more popular, to be good at everything you tried, would have had more friends. On a more serious level, you could have kept your family members alive. Lose a grandparent, raise somebody from the dead. Man, it must have been incredible to be God in the sense of being a young person in the world, but also have this ability, right? I mean, that's what the whole theme of the movie Bruce Almighty is, a human with God's powers. There's an interesting fact that sheds some light on those things. We read in Luke 2 where Jesus was a 12-year-old and Mary and Joseph were looking for him chronologically, looking at the Gospels. That story from last week, that's the last time that we hear about Joseph, Mary's husband. Maybe this isn't something that you've thought about before. Maybe this is something you have thought a lot about. But it's something to consider because of the implications on Jesus' life. Most scholars agree that Joseph likely died sometime before Jesus' public ministry. So we don't know exactly how it happened. It's never quite mentioned. But between the ages of 12 in the story we read last week for Jesus and 30. When he was expected to have started his public ministry, we see Christ's baptism and subsequent public ministry start around that time. Between then, Jesus lost his earthly dad, this person who helped raise him in the world. We know that this is the case, it's not just that, Joseph was building chairs or whatever, Joseph, he was at work. During all the things that you read, he was just out fishing or he was, hanging with his buddies. We know that's not the case because even on the cross in John 19:27, he assigns the care of his mother. The passage where he says, "Look," and he's talking to his disciple, "Look, there is your mother." He says, "Treat her like your own mom." What he's doing is he knows that she needs to be a part of someone's household. As an older woman at that point in age, at that point in history, you had to be a part of a household in order to be taken care of and protected and cared for. So he's like, "There is your mother and there is your son," basically assigning care to her, which he wouldn't have done if she had somebody else. That wouldn't have happened if Joseph was still alive. So we can use that as kind of an indication that indeed it wasn't just that he was absent or that he wasn't mentioned. Besides, that doesn't fit within his character of what we see early on in the Gospels. We know that at some point Joseph passed away. So what, you might wonder? Why does that really matter? What that means is that Jesus, as a young person before the gospel stories that we know, was not out there flexing his miracle muscle to make his life easy. He wasn't, put there as some benevolent superhero that didn't know what it was like to suffer. Instead, this detail of Jesus' life paints a much more contrasting picture. Instead of some avenger living the good life, he was a kid who was from a town that was thought of as a tiny spot on the map. In fact, the label of the Nazarene, when you hear people saying, well, you're talking about the Nazarene, it's not just being like, oh yeah, Chris from West Des Moines or wherever that is. The point is that that label follows him because they're kind of incredulous. Because people know of Nazareth. But as it says in the book of John, Nathanael asked, can anything good come from Nazareth? He mentions good, but he also said, can anything come from Nazareth? We just thought that was kind of a place, right? You ever pass a small town and you're like, man, I've lived in this state my whole life. I've never heard of this town. I wonder what it's like to live there. That was Nazareth. That's where he grew up, and he did that. So instead of some superhero, right? Instead of some superpower, everyone's best friend, homecoming king, no struggle, he knows for a fact that he grew up instead in the middle of nowhere. He lost his dad and had to struggle through those different circumstances. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Now, that compounded with the idea that Jesus lost his dad at some point meant that as he contended with those difficult things, not taking the out, there's a lot of talk about whether or not Jesus could use those abilities or not. We don't get to know that because we are not God. But the point is that these weren't powers to be manipulated. Indeed, this was in a relationship with God, and Jesus experienced many of the things that we have. And it highlights what is one of the most difficult things that Jesus would have had to contend with in his young life, as well as the thing that we all have to deal with this side of heaven as well, and that's loss. I don't mean this to be a complete bummer of a topic. Many of you know that I struggle with chronic joyful disposition. Like I wake up, like I haven't had any coffee. Like my face always kind of looks like someone just offered me Skittles. Right? Like, so a lot of times I get asked to do like Ash Wednesday because you're going to die. But you guys, this is going to be fine. But the point is that everybody, whether you are like me or whether you are Eeyore, right? The polar opposite. I'm more of a Tigger. In Winnie the Pooh character, but whether you're a Tigger or whether you're an Eeyore or whether you're somewhere in between, loss is something that finds each and every one of us, and we have to contend with it in a number of different ways. So we're going to talk about what loss actually is, and a lot of us get that wrong, how we can engage with it, and where we can go from there. So what is loss? An important thing is to talk about what it isn't first. Loss doesn't just have to do with the death of a loved one, but this is often the case with loss, but throughout the various stages of life, we all lose things in a number of different ways. So in the death sense, about all of us, I do like to say, we have 20s through, 90s represented in Men of Hope on a Wednesday morning based off of who signed up. Like, we have people from all different stages of life. So about all of us have lost grandparents, right? Maybe some of us haven't had that experience. Maybe you didn't know your grandparents. But we've all dealt with a lot of that in the same way. But if we haven't, seeing our parents or our mentors enter a different stage of life, seeing family members and friends, we could be mourning the loss of how things used to be. Because maybe we're seeing those that raised us or those who have lifted us up in times of hardship experience those hardships themselves. That's a really hard thing to do. That is also another sense of loss because you're mourning the way that things used to be. You're mourning the death of a life that you used to have with some of these people who would be with us. But they might still be here, but it's definitely different. Maybe you're mourning the ease of relationships that have been afforded to us in our lives. In all of us as young adults, regardless of when you grew up, we were given automatic communities to be a part of. In school, we're put into classes and groups of people who are literally in the same stage of life as you. You ever think about this? It's just society is organized so that people, when you're young, you're in the same exact grade. the people who are the exact same stage of life. Then you get to college, and you're organized into groups of people who are interested in the same things as you. I was a music major, and I was put in with a bunch of other folks who were interested in the same topics that I was. They were also nerds. They were also interested in particular things. Occasionally, I was put in with a Packer fan. It was terrible. But the point being is that we all do that, but then all of a sudden you get thrown into a job, into a department, into a setting in which you could go all day, maybe all week without interacting with somebody who is as close to you in demographic as somebody is in school, right? Then time goes on and you have certain expectations for yourself and what life will look like, and sometimes it goes according to plan and sometimes it just doesn't. Life happens, and things that you think would happen don't, and other things that you think might not happen, they definitely do happen, right? There's a song by the band Dawes, Things Happen. It's all they ever do. And the point is that life continues to go on and throw us curveballs. People have different careers that they thought, different family situations, different physical limitations or abilities, and you wonder. So if you're wondering why you're struggling with some of those things, or one big thing in particular maybe, because something's changed, you see why that's understandable. You're actually dealing with loss in a lot of ways. It's loss of a relationship, a loss of expectations, the loss of a future, of a job, of these different things that you thought the way that life was going to be, and it's just not. I won't show a clip because of time this morning. There's this great movie called Inside Out. I've shown a clip of it before. It's the little Pixar emotions rolling around in people's brains, and there's it's in the head of an adolescent as she figures out how to deal with the world. There's joy, there's worry, there's anger, there's disgust, there's sadness. In the new movie, there's anxiety, right? But there is no loss character, because what we're watching in this scene it highlights an important idea. Loss is not a feeling. A lot of us think that it evokes feelings in us, but what loss is not is some sort of sad feeling. Loss is the acknowledgement of change. Loss is the realization of something that is true. Man, this is not the same as it once was. Loss is going, oh man, this person was here and now they're not here. Feeling and mourning in this sense of loss is going, you know what? I won't get to do that with that person anymore. Notice that person, in order for that to be true, that person doesn't have to have passed away. That's just, maybe they moved away. Maybe you lost a great neighbor. Maybe a friend is on a different stage of life, and now your friend group or your small group is a completely different dynamic simply because somebody's moved on or done something different. Loss is the acknowledgement of change. Loss is knowing things aren't going to be the same. And just like in that movie, all of the different emotions try to deal with it in their own different ways. That's why loss is so tricky, because sometimes there's elation of, wow, life can be different than it was before. But then, oh man, I feel sad because it's not the way that it was, and there's worry, like, oh my gosh, am I going to be okay? And then there's disgust of, oh my goodness, what a broken world is it out here? You see what I'm saying is that all emotions play into this realization of loss. And we can be excited about the possibilities of moving to a new city and starting a new job. And also at the same time, we can feel sad at the coworkers we're leaving behind, or the old favorite spots in the city you're moving away from. You could feel anger at a relationship that's ending, and relief that the tension you've entered in for so long won't be a part of your daily routine, and sadness at the end of the connection you had with someone. You feel lost because you no longer have that present and the future the way that you remember things being, so you're mourning a loss. We get so frustrated by the existence of it all, and so people ask pastors, all the time, why would a good God allow this loss to happen to us? The important thing is that with the loss of Joseph, Jesus didn't even stop it for himself. Jesus went through loss. Jesus didn't use God powers in order to avoid having to deal with some of this stuff. He lost his dad, and he did it earlier than life expectancy was not what it was what it is now. And Jesus lost his dad earlier than many of us have had to do, or even that's expected we would have to. He experienced that loss that so many people have to experience eventually. He had to mourn and to learn from that experience and continue on. I know that we're talking about before the Gospels, but to bring the conversation in this topic to a close, another place where Jesus models what this kind of looks like is the shortest verse in the Bible, John chapter 11, verse 35. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, right? This is what we're talking about this morning. The God of the universe, the one in that story that knew he was going to defeat the power of sin and death, the one that knew he would raise his friend from the dead in mere moments, that God looked and saw one of his best friends gone and took the time to mourn. He still wept. So why, if God decides that God needs to cry, why are you pretending that you don't need to deal with grief? If God decides that it's important to sit in that for a second and try to deal with that, then why do so many of us pretend that we don't need to go through the process? Right? It's certainly Jesus didn't, quote unquote, need to mourn, right? Or perhaps God in this story is trying to tell us something. Yeah, you might say, I'm definitely dealing with loss, but what do I do with that? Maybe you're in the middle of it right now, mourning something, and it's really difficult and really disorienting, and you just want it to stop. I can tell you the answer is not overeating or turning to distractions, turning to substances. I can tell you that it isn't trying to numb yourself until you've completely dissociated from everything. Instead, the truth can be found in one of the books of wisdom that Pastor Jeremy actually talked about in the sermon this last weekend, although it's a different passage. The book of Ecclesiastes says in chapter 3, we're rounding the corner on here. I know I'm a couple minutes over, but we are done very soon. Feel free to flip to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. It's one of the books of wisdom. And it's attributed to Solomon, at least large portions of it are. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, even if you're like, Ecclesiastes, which one is that again? You've probably heard this one. It talks about a time for everything. There's a time for everything. For everything there's a season, a time for everything, every activity under the sun. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to quiet and a time to speak, time to love and a time to hate. And then the word translates to have anger, have that righteous anger. There's a time to love, and there's also a time for that frustration in it. A time for war and a time for peace. We don't like having to go through the struggle of mourning any sort of loss as we contend with that. We don't like to go through discomfort because the world around us tells us that there's a cure for all of it. And if you're experiencing pain, it's because you either haven't tried hard enough or you either haven't tried hard enough to numb it out or you haven't tried hard enough to keep yourself out of that circumstance. That's the messaging of the world. But the truth of the matter is that we all go through pain in this side of heaven, but you need to face your struggles or they will still live in you. I almost said you have to face your demons, but that's a different thing, right? What I'm saying is you have to deal with these frustrations in your life, or else they will continue to be with you and manifest in a lot of different ways, come out sideways at different people in your life. Jesus demonstrated the necessity of going through struggle and hardship, knowing that God is with us. Not only did Jesus lose his earthly dad, but also went through the process of struggling on a cross for us. While you cannot defeat sin and death, on your own. We can undergo hardship for both our own personal development and for the benefit of our loved ones. Growth doesn't happen unless we do. But God is with us every step of the way. Again, I don't mean for this to be a bummer this morning, but I'm saying no matter what we are going through, whatever we are mourning, whatever loss we are mourning through, Jesus knows how we feel. Jesus knows what it is like to struggle both on the cross and before it in this circumstance in which he experienced loss in his own personal family. And that same Jesus walks alongside us in whatever we are facing, welcoming us into a new day. Amen. So some questions to help us kind of think through some of these things. What is the loss that you're contending with right now? Like I said, everybody's in the process of losing something because we live in a world marked by death, the death of relationships, the death of expectations, the death of meaning in a lot of ways. I'm not trying to be morbid. I'm just saying, like, we live in a world where people are broken, and that's including each and every one of us, and so there's struggle. So loss could be, any kind of struggle we're going through can be seen as some sort of loss. So just what is that right now? Maybe you've never looked at it that way. Maybe that's something that you need to take time to consider. What is that? And then how are you dealing with that loss? Also very important. Some of you are like, yes, therapy. Yes, prayer. Some of the rest of us are, yes, family bag of Doritos. Right? There's a lot of different ways to handle those things, but how are you handling with loss? And then what's a better way to handle that brokenness this week? Or if you're doing great and you somehow are in that camp of, man, really killing it, right? Like really doing a great job right now. Maybe it's what's another way that we can invite God into that process of mourning? Have you let God into that situation yet? All good things to consider. Amen? I'll make the time up to you later. Grace and peace, friends. Go be good to each other. We'll see you next week.